Grant and the Mexican War. Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. Porfirio Diaz. For myself, I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war, which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies and not considering justice in their desire to acquire additional territory. Before we put Grant into the Mexican War, let's take a look at why the Mexican War started in the first place. Mexico was part of a territory claimed by Spain that went from Panama to a little past the Canadian border. The colony lasted about 1520 to 1820. It was a huge territory. Spain never really administered it. When Mexico finally kicked Spain out, Mexicans inherited all that territory. It was impossible for them to really govern all that land. There were very few Mexicans in the northern territories. There were some in California and New Mexico, a few scattered elsewhere. In the early 1800s, there were fewer than 3,500 Mexicans in Texas. The Mexicans were having serious problems with the Comanches and the Apaches, who thought it was their land because they were there first. It was so bad, one town lived completely underground. They asked the government for help, but they were only sent 200 soldiers, not enough for the state of Texas. The Mexican government then decided to invite in Anglos from the United States to settle Texas and become Mexican citizens. One person they dealt with was Stephen Austin. However, the settlers were told slavery was not allowed. Most of the immigrants were from the South and many had slaves. Since Texas had some good cotton growing farmland, having slaves made the cotton fields productive. More and more immigrants came, and soon Anglos outnumbered Mexicans. In addition, Anglos who were Protestant had chips on their shoulders and didn't get along with the darker skinned Catholic Mexicans. There was even talk of enslaving Mexicans. By 1835, there were 30,000 Anglos, 7,000 Mexicans, and 5,000 slaves. President Bustamante reminded settlers that slavery was illegal and stopped allowing Anglo immigration into Texas. But just after he did that, there was yet another revolution in Mexico. Revolutions in Mexico were quite common. The Anglo-Texians decided to have a revolution of their own during the uproar with the Mexican government and started arming. Santa Anna took over the Mexican government and sent troops to put down the Texian revolution. Things got brutal. At the Alamo, depending on which side you believe, between 60 and 600 Mexicans died, and all the Anglos died, around 250. At Goliad, 425 Texans who had surrendered were taken out and slaughtered. But in the final battle that produced victory for the Texans, the Battle of San Jacinto, the Mexicans paid dearly. The battle lasted 18 minutes. After the battle, the Texians slaughtered 600 Mexican men, women, and children, while 600 Mexicans got away. Then the Texians caught Santa Anna, and the next day gave him a choice of signing a treaty that gave Texas independence or dying. He signed the treaty, but always claimed that it was under duress. The Texians then let Santa Anna go, a decision they may have regretted later. They almost immediately applied for statehood. The only reason they were an independent country for 10 years was their failure to get statehood for that long. It was the slavery issue. Finally, on December 29th, 1845, Congress gave Texas admission to the Union. But the Texians were still not happy. Even though hardly any Texians lived there, they claimed the land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. The Mexicans said the province of Texas border was always the Nueces. They would put the southwest border at Corpus Christi. President Polk decided to use this issue to start a fight with Mexico. He wanted more slave territory in California and all the areas in between. Back to Ulysses. In the first part about Grant's youth, Grant had applied for leave to visit his parents because there were rumors that the fourth was going to be sent to Natchitoches. And when he was already in transit on the boat, the fourth was ordered out immediately. He got a letter from his friend when he arrived at his parents' house telling him about it and not to open anything from the military. The friend said he would take all of Grant's belongings to Natchitoches. Grant's diary was with his belongings and he never saw it again. After he became famous, he lived in fear that one day he would see it published in some newspaper and would cause much heartburning on his part. Julia had turned down wearing his ring before he left, but changed her mind after he left. While at his parents', he realized that there was really something, he said, the matter with me, and was determined to ask her to marry him. After returning to St. Louis and getting secretly engaged to Julia, Grant headed down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and then took another boat up the Red River to Natchitoches. He wrote Julia about his trip. My journey up the Red River was not so pleasant as the other. The boat was quite small and considerably crowded with passengers that not of the most pleasant sort, a number of them being what are usually called blacklegs or gamblers, and some of them with very cutthroat appearances. There were some of them that I should very much dislike to meet unarmed and in a retired place, there knowing I had $100 about me. Likely, I judge harshly. When Grant arrived, he found out that his company was to be 3 miles away from Natchitoches. It probably had something to do with the problem of diseases when too many people were crowded together in one spot without a sewer system. Their camping spot was called Camp Salubrity. Here Grant paints a picture of the new camp for Julia. So June 4th, 1844. We are on the top of a high ridge with about the best spring water in Louisiana running near. There is nothing but pine woods surrounding us, and they infested to an enormous degree with ticks, red bugs, and a little creeping thing that looks like a lizard, but I don't know the name of. This last vermin is singularly partial to society and becomes so very intimate and sociable on a short acquaintance as to visit our tents, crawl into our beds, etc., etc. 'Tis said they are very innocent, but I don't like the looks of them. This is another excerpt from the same letter. Julia, I cannot express the regrets that I feel at having to leave Jeff Barracks at the time that I did. I was just learning how to enjoy the place and the society, at least part of it. Blank plus 23 more blanks. Read these blank lines just as I intend them, and they will express more than words. You must not forget to write soon and what to seal with. Until I hear from you, I shall be, I don't know what I was going to say, but I reckon it was your most humble and obedient friend, Ulysses S. Grant. What do you think he meant by the blank lines? In this letter dated August 31st, 1844, he explains the meaning of the lines and is shocked that she couldn't guess the meaning. You say you were at loss to ascribe a meaning to the blank lines in my first letter? Nothing is easier. They were only intended to express an attachment which words would fail to express. Ulysses seemed to have an almost mother-son relationship with Mrs. Bailey. The letter is still available because she saved it, even though he wasn't famous at the time. They lived next door, and her sons were his friends, so he probably spent a lot of time at their house. Mrs. Bailey was demonstrative. Mrs. Grant was careful not to be demonstrative, only praising God. Notice that he wants an answer to his letter as soon as possible. Mrs. Bailey, my journey fortunately is at an end, and agreeably to your request and my own pleasure, I hasten to notify you of my safe arrival here, marked with no incident save one worth relating, and one that is laughable, curious, important, surprising, etc., etc., but I can't tell it now. It is for the present a secret, but I will tell it to you sometime. You must not guess what it is, for you will go wrong. On my route, I called around by the way of St. Louis and Jefferson Barracks, where I spent 4 or 5 days very pleasantly among my newly made acquaintances. I would be happy to have an answer to this letter as early as possible, and if nothing more, a postscript from the young ladies. Ladies are always so much better at giving the news than others, and then there is nothing doing or said about Georgetown that I would not like to hear. This is probably the earliest picture on record for Grant. He is in Natchitoches, where the 4th Infantry was stationed as part of the Army of Observation. The Army was there to keep Mexico from causing any trouble because their former province was being annexed to the United States against their will. They were there over a year, from June 1844 to August 1845. Grant claimed to have a good time racing horses and attending parties given for the officers by the planters in the area. In the picture, he is there with his friend Alexander Hayes. Grant is with his racing pony Dandy, and Hayes is with his Palomino Sunshine. I think Grant looks like a 10-year-old in the picture. The picture belonged to the Hayes family. Hayes was killed in the Battle of the Wilderness in Virginia during the Civil War. Grant was the head general by that time. After the war, Grant renamed a fort in Kansas Fort Hayes in honor of his friend. A town nearby took the same name. In May 1845, Grant asked for and received a leave so he could visit Julia and get her father's permission to marry her. When he arrived, neighbors and friends were gathered on the porch to say goodbye to Mr. Dent, who was going on a business trip to Maryland. In her book, Julia said he barely touched her hand and then went up on the porch to greet all the people he knew. He then asked Mr. Dent if he could accompany him to the railroad station. Things didn't go as planned. When he asked Mr. Dent for permission to marry Julia, he was turned down. Dent said that Julia was way too delicate for army life, but if he wanted her sister Nellie, that would work because Nellie was a lot tougher than Julia. Grant was dumbfounded. He insisted that he did not want to marry Nellie. He only wanted to marry Julia. Finally, Mr. Dent gave him permission to write to Julia and said if they were still faithful to each other for 1 or 2 years, they could marry. This is a picture of what Whitehaven looks like today. It is a National Historic Site. The reason it is green is that the Grants owned it after Mr. Dent's death, and they had it painted this color because it was popular at the time. The 4th Infantry moved in July 1845 to New Orleans and spent some weeks there without further orders. Grant describes their days there this way. We reached there before the middle of the month and again waited weeks for still further orders. The yellow fever was raging in New Orleans during the time we remained there, and the streets of the city had the appearance of a continuous, well-observed Sunday. One morning, while in the barracks, Grant heard gunshots and looked out the window to see 2 groups of men gathered on the lawn. He asked about it and was told that 2 gentlemen had settled their differences. Grant decided that dueling was really stupid. He said that if someone had really done something to him so bad that he was willing to kill him, he would not give him the choice of time, place, weapons, and distance separating them before he executed him. Meanwhile, back at the White House, pro-slavery President Polk is plotting to add more slave territory to the United States. But he had some predicaments. First, he offered to buy the land from Mexico. They turned him down. Then he decided, the heck with it, we'll just take it away from them. But to do that, he needed a general. The head general of the army was Winfield Scott. He, by right, should have the right to lead the army into Mexico, but he was a Whig, the other party, anti-slavery, and he had political ambitions. Winning generals usually win political elections. Polk had to ignore him and reach down to a colonel, Zachary Taylor, making him a brevet general and putting him in charge of the army. The other problem was the slavery expansion problem. The majority of the North was against and would not be for starting a war to add more slave states to the Union. Polk decided that the U.S. had to go down to Texas and get as close to Mexico as possible and then somehow provoke them into attacking U.S. troops. Here is a chart showing how dangerous this war was compared to previous wars. The American Revolution killed 2% of participating soldiers. The War of 1812 killed 0.8% of soldiers, and the Mexican War killed over 16.9% of participating soldiers. Why do you think the number went up so high? And why did the rate go down after the Civil War? This is the path of the 4th Infantry from Natchitoches to Corpus Christi in July 1845. Corpus Christi is where the Nueces empties into the Gulf of Mexico. This was the western border of Texas, according to Mexico. The army spent from July to the following March, right at Corpus Christi. This is what the camp looked like. They were there for 9 months. The camp followers made it down after a while, and things got a little more interesting and maybe a little more out of control. The Corpus Christi Bay was only 3 feet deep, so getting the ships unloaded took a monumental effort. The men actually had to drag ships close to shore. Taylor had about 3,000 troops with him. Grant had sailed on the ship Sevilla. One day he had to return to the ship and saw an incident he wished he hadn't seen. He heard a ruckus on the ship, and it turned out to be the captain. The captain was an excitable, small little man dying from consumption. He weighed about 100 pounds and carried a sword as big as he was. Grant recalls him using sailor language such as "damn your eyes" and was crying that men had mutinied. Grant noticed that the three men, so-called mutineers, were very cooperative when placed in irons, and Grant did not think they knew they had mutinied. But the captain had to be sustained no matter what. Grant thought it was a sad situation and hoped the men were not convicted. An historian checked, and the captain was dead in 3 months, and the men were released. On the same trip, when he was returning, he had to get down off the ship to a lower ship. A crew member lowered passengers with a device employing a single and double pulley. Grant watched him do it for a while, then decided he could lower himself down. He stepped off, putting his feet on the lower block. Just then he heard the words, "Hold on." "Well," he said in his memoirs, "I tried to hold on, but my feet went up and my head went down so fast that I lost my grip and fell 25 feet into the water. I thought I would never quit sinking." But he kept his presence of mind and swam around until a bucket could be lowered for him. When other passengers and crew found him unhurt, they were not sympathetic, but Grant says he enjoyed the joke himself. The name of the army Grant was in kept changing. In Louisiana, they were the Army of Observation. They were there just in case of a Mexican attack during U.S. negotiations with Texas for annexation. Their presence was a warning to Mexico to leave Texas alone. When they moved into Texas, east of the Nueces, they were the Army of Occupation. Their mission was to provide security for the new state of Texas. When they moved to the Rio Grande, they were the Army of Provocation. Grant said, "We were sent to provoke a fight, but it was essential that Mexico should commence it." The Army passed 9 months hanging out on the Corpus Christi beach. They had camp followers to deal with and soldiers getting antsy. The officers decided they needed a theater to help pass the time. Taylor thought theater would keep the men from gambling, from the prostitutes, and from the bars. They built a theater with 800 seats and decided to put on Othello. Box seats were $1 and regular seats were 50 cents. Since they were only males, they had different officers try out for the part of Desdemona. Longstreet, 6'2", was too tall. Grant looked good in crinolines, but the male actor said he couldn't play against Grant because he did not have the right sentiment. So they sent to New Orleans for a professional actress. This is what a crinoline looked like. A future political opponent of Grant's would have loved to have a photo of him in crinolines. In December 1845, Grant got a chance to travel with the paymaster to San Antonio and Austin. Taylor encouraged officers to accompany the paymaster, but they had to take leave. Grant went with his friends Christopher Auger and Calvin Benjamin. The first place they passed through was San Patricio, but it was deserted. Then on to Goliad. There had been a massacre at Goliad, so only a few residents were left. There was one man who they actually knew from Louisiana. He was living there with one female slave, building a home for his family to come to. Then on to San Antonio. San Antonio was equally divided in population between Americans and Mexicans. It had to be, or one group would have killed the other group. Going through New Braunfels, there were a few Germans living in a tiny shack. They decided not to spend a lot of time in Austin, so they went back to San Antonio. From there, Grant and his friends had to head back on their own before their leave was up. When Christopher Auger got sick, they left him with their friend at Goliad to await the paymaster. While there, Grant tried hunting. He went out to shoot turkeys, but found himself just watching the turkeys, no urge to shoot them. He concluded he was a failure as a hunter. Grant and Calvin Benjamin headed back because their leave was really getting close. One night they heard wolves howling until Benjamin asked Grant just how many he thought they were. Grant wanted to guess a low number, much smaller than he really thought, so he said about 20. Benjamin said, "Let's go see." Grant didn't want to be a coward, but if Benjamin had suggested turning around, he would have seconded it. They kept getting nearer. The sound kept getting louder until finally they were almost at the wolves. When they finally saw them, there were only two of them, howling on their haunches with their mouths together. Grant thought they were like noisy politicians. There are always more of them until they're counted. Grant was very impressed by Taylor. He liked the way Taylor was friendly to everyone, no matter their rank. He admired the way he worked with what he got from the government. He did not use lack of supplies as a reason not to do his job. Taylor wore a Mexican hat and a canvas overcoat, no uniform. Grant liked that Taylor was on the field with the soldiers during battle instead of staying behind trying to run things from headquarters. Grant said that General Taylor never made any great show or parade, either of uniform or retinue. In dress, he was possibly too plain, rarely wearing anything in the field to indicate his rank, or even that he was an officer. But he was known to every soldier in his army and was respected by all. And Taylor had observed Grant. He liked that Grant was willing to do what it takes to show his workers what needed to be done, even when other officers laughed at him for getting down and working with them. He had observed Grant and noticed ingenuity and perseverance. Taylor really needed good people to work on supplying the army in a foreign country. They were going into the interior. The people spoke a different language. He decided Grant would make a good quartermaster, so he made him regimental quartermaster. Grant was unhappy. He wrote to his immediate commander, Garland, "I respectfully protest against being assigned to a duty which removes me from sharing in the dangers and honors of service with my company at the front, and respectfully ask to be permitted to resume my place in line." Grant gets a response. Lieutenant Grant is respectfully informed that his protest cannot be considered. Lieutenant Grant was assigned to duty as quartermaster and commissary because of his observed ability, skill, and persistency in the line of duty. The commanding officer is confident that Lieutenant Grant can best serve his country under present emergencies under this assignment. From Lieutenant Garland, 4th Infantry Commander Brigade. One of the tasks that Grant was in charge of was breaking wild mules to harness to pull wagons full of supplies. Wild mules are harder to break than domesticated ones, but Grant knew just how to do it. They had hired a lot of foreigners, mostly Irish, who worked for cheap and claimed to be teamsters. Some had never even ridden a horse. Observing this, Grant got them working together. 5 mules were allotted to each wagon. A teamster would select at the picket rope 5 animals of nearly the same color and general appearance for his team. With a full corps of assistants, who were other teamsters, he would then proceed to get his mules together. In twos, the men would approach each animal selected, avoiding as far as possible its heels. 2 ropes would be put around the neck of each animal with a slip noose so that he could be choked if too unruly. They were then let out, harnessed by force, and hitched to a wagon in the position they would have to keep forever. 2 men remained on either side of the leader, with the lassos about its neck, and 1 man retained the same restraining influence over each of the others. All being ready, the whole would be slackened and the team started. The first motion was generally 5 mules in the air at one time, backs bowed, hind feet extended to the rear. After repeating this movement a few times, the leaders would start to run. This would bring the breeching tight against the mules at the wheels, which these last seemed to regard as a most unwarrantable attempt at coercion, and would resist by taking a seat or sometimes going so far as to lie down. In time, all were broken in to do their duty submissively, if not cheerfully. All the officers kept horses because they were cheap and free to feed because they just grazed. Grant had 3 horses, but the day before they were to leave Corpus Christi, they got away from his servant on a trip to water. Grant decided he would just march with the men, but his company captain, Captain McCall, bought him an unbroken horse. When they were about to start, he said, "There, Grant, is a horse for you." Grant describes what happened next. I found that he could not bear the idea of his servant riding on a long march while his lieutenant went afoot. He had found a Mustang, a 3-year-old colt only recently captured, and purchased it for the sum of $3. I was sorry to take him because I really felt that, belonging to a foot regiment, I should march. But I saw the captain's earnestness in the matter and accepted the horse for a trip. The day we started was the first time the horse had ever been under saddle. I had, however, but little difficulty in breaking him, though for the first day there were frequent disagreements between us as to which way we should go, and sometimes whether we should go at all. At no time during the day could I choose exactly the part of the column I would march with, but after that I had as tractable a horse as any with the army, and there were none that stood the trip better. He never ate a mouthful of food on the journey except the grass he could pick with the length of his picket rope. This is the route the Army took to the Rio Grande. Today, a highway follows that route from Corpus Christi to Brownsville. It was a tough route back then, with very little water and lots of snakes. The distance from Corpus Christi to Brownsville is about 160 miles. On the march, they saw an amazing wild horse herd. According to Grant, it was the very band from which the horse I was riding had been captured but a few weeks before. The column was halted for a rest, and a number of officers, myself among them, rode out 2 or 3 miles to the right to see the extent of the herd. The country was a rolling prairie, and from the higher ground the vision was obstructed only by the earth's curvature. As far as the eye could reach to our right, the herd extended. To the left, it extended equally. There was no estimating the number of animals in it. I have no idea that they could have all been corralled in the state of Rhode Island or Delaware at one time. Things got a little more interesting near the Rio Grande. There was a Mexican city across the river called Matamoros. Young Mexican women came daily down to the Rio Grande to bathe. As days passed, the audience grew from dozens to hundreds. The soldiers would sit on a hill and watch. One afternoon, a party of Taylor's young officers walked through the Yankee line, stripped, and began bathing close to the shore. As an answer, a bevy of Mexican girls laughed their way past their sentries and, stepping out of their bright, flaring skirts, pulled their snowy chemises over their heads and slipped naked into the stream. The two groups kept moving to the center of the river, closer and closer, but before they could meet, the Mexican sentries lowered their guns at the naked officers and they backed off. One soldier described it in a letter home. The girls chase each other, diving into the depths of the stream or swimming along its surface with their long, loose raven tresses flowing behind them. They laugh, shout, sing, wrestle with each other, and display their graceful forms in 1,000 agile movements. Rain fell all night long, but it did not dampen the Yankees' fears that Mexican soldiers would attack and the Mexican girls would not. Finally, it happened. The Mexicans fell for it. They attacked some Americans. Taylor received reports on April 24th, 1846, of Mexicans crossing the Rio Grande. He ordered Captain Seth B. Thornton with 2 dragoon companies to investigate upriver. Thornton rode into an ambush with his 80-man force. It was quickly overwhelmed by Mexican General Torreon's 1,600, resulting in the capture of those not immediately killed. Thornton's guide brought news of the hostilities to Taylor and was followed by a cart from Torreon containing the 6 wounded. Torreon stated he could not care for them. In the fierce encounter, 14 of Thornton's men were killed, 6 wounded, and 1 was fatally wounded, while the rest were taken prisoner. At last, Taylor could let Polk know that Mexicans had picked a fight with his army and had spilled American blood on American soil. This gave Polk the chance he wanted to declare war on Mexico. His statement read, "The cup of forbearance has been exhausted even before the recent information from the frontier of the Del Norte." The Del Norte was the Rio Grande. But now, after reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that 2 nations are now at war. As war exists, and notwithstanding all of our efforts to avoid it, exists by the act of Mexico herself. Lincoln, who was in the House of Representatives at the time, did not agree that American blood had been spilled on American soil. So he asked a few questions which became known as the spot resolutions. First, whether the spot of soil on which the blood of our citizens was shed, as in his messages declared, was or was not within the territories of Spain, at least from the Treaty of 1819 until the Mexican Revolution. Second, whether that spot is or is not within the territory which was wrested from Spain by the Mexican Revolution. Third, whether that spot is or is not within a settlement of people which settlement had existed ever since long before the Texas Revolution until its inhabitants fled from the approach of the United States Army. He goes on to ask some more questions like this, but he's calling people's attention to the fact that this may not have actually happened on American soil. This is a map showing the location of Fort Texas. Because Fort Texas was running out of supplies, it was necessary to leave a garrison at the fort and take a larger group to Point Isabel, where ships were holding supplies. Grant went with Taylor to get supplies, a journey of about 20 miles. If you're wondering if that was the Rio Grande or not, the Rio Grande was named El Rio Bravo del Norte, or the Fierce River of the North, by Spanish explorers in the 1500s. It is still known as Rio Bravo in Mexico. This map shows the theater of operations from April 25th to May 18th, 1846. At the very bottom of the map, you'll see the city Matamoros, then a river, which is the Rio Grande, and across from the river is Fort Texas. If you follow the little trail up, you'll see Resaca de la Palma, that's a battle, and Palo Alto, another battle. If you keep following the little black dotted line up and go over toward the water, you'll see Point Isabel. That is where the ships were waiting with supplies. If you want to see where Thornton was attacked, you can look at the left side of the map, kind of near the middle, a little bit above, and you'll see Thornton was ambushed April 25th. Laying in his tent one morning on the beach, Grant could hear cannons sounding and the war beginning. Fort Texas was under siege by the Mexican army. In his personal memoirs, Grant says this about it. What General Taylor's feelings were during this suspense, I do not know. But for myself, a young second lieutenant who had never heard a hostile gun before, I felt sorry that I had enlisted. A great many men, when they smell battle afar, chafe to get into the fray. When they say so themselves, they generally fail to convince their hearers that they are as anxious as they would like to make believe. And as they approach danger, they become more subdued. Now, this rule is not universal, for I have known a few men who were always aching for a fight and were as good as their word when the battle did come. As they were returning from Point Isabel with supplies, they suddenly came across a line of Mexican soldiers ready for battle. This is what Grant had to say about it. As I looked down that long line of about 3,000 armed men advancing toward a larger force also armed, I thought, what a fearful responsibility General Taylor must feel, commanding such a host and so far away from friends. This was to be the Battle of Palo Alto, the first battle of the Mexican War. The Americans had 2,300 and the Mexicans had 3,700, but it was the flying artillery created by Major Ringgold that won the day. Unfortunately, he died on this battlefield by a cannonball. Near the end of the day, Grant was standing near some soldiers who were hit by a cannonball. One soldier had his head blown off with the bones and brains injuring people around them. Captain Page had his lower jaw blown off and lingered for several days. Later in the Civil War, Grant was talking to a young soldier when he suddenly went into kind of a trance. He told people after that he realized that he was talking to Page's son. The next day they fought the Battle of Resaca de la Palma around one of the old Oxbow lakes created when the Rio Grande changed course. Because Grant's commander had to go on a reconnaissance mission, he was put in charge of about 20 men, an honor he thought very great indeed. He moved them forward through the chaparral, which were very thick shrub-like plants. And his words, at last I got pretty close up without knowing it. The balls commenced to whistle very thick overhead, cutting the limbs of the chaparral right and left. We could not see the enemy, so I ordered my men to lie down, an order that did not have to be enforced. He then moved his men to another area with less vegetation and moved forward again. Here they took a few prisoners. Then he found out that the prisoners were already captured. Now, this is 1800s humor. My exploit was equal to that of a soldier who boasted that he had cut off the leg of one of the enemy. When asked why he did not cut off his head, he replied, someone had done that before. This left no doubt in my mind but that the Battle of Resaca de la Palma would have been won just as it was if I had not been there. Here's a May 11th, 1846 letter to Julia after the battle. Grant discovers that he can keep his head in battle. Although the balls were whizzing thick and fast about me, I did not feel a sensation of fear until nearly the close of the firing. A ball struck close by me, killing one man instantly. It knocked Captain Page's underjaw off entirely and broke in the roof of his mouth, and knocked Lieutenant Wallen and one sergeant down besides, but they were not much hurt. Captain Page is still alive. There is no great sport in having bullets flying about one in every direction, but I find they have less horror when among them than when in anticipation. The May 11th, 1846 letter to Julia continues. I am in hopes, my dear Julia, that we will soon be able to end it. In the thickest of it, I thought of Julia. How much I should love to see you now, to tell you all that happened. Mr. Hazlitt come out alive and whole. When we have another engagement, if we do have another at all, I will write again. That is, if I am not one of the victims. He is hoping that it is almost over. He cannot see that they are just beginning and that there's going to be 2 more years of battle and 2 more years before he gets to see Julia again. With the end of the Resaca de Palma battle, the siege was lifted. Mexicans had withdrawn to Monterrey, Mexico. At the fort, 2 people had been killed. One was the commander, Jacob Brown. Taylor issued an order changing the name of the fort to Fort Brown. Since then, a town of considerable importance has sprung up on the ground occupied by the fort and troops, which has also taken his name. Grant wrote a letter to Julia using a drum left behind by the Mexicans as a desk. When the battle was over, the men discovered that the press was fighting it out in the north. The battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de Palma seemed to us engaged as pretty important affairs, but we had only a faint conception of their magnitude until they were fought over in the north by the press and the reports came back to us. At the same time, or about the same time, we learned that war existed between the United States and Mexico by acts of the latter country. Taylor then led his army into Matamoros for an occupation. Then more troops and more trouble began to arrive. Volunteers began to arrive from Louisiana, more from Texas, Ohio, Illinois, Georgia, Maryland. The number of troops went up to 9,000. Lack of adequate facilities caused problems. Cramped quarters, mosquitoes, boredom. At one point, there was a catfish war that caused soldiers to square off and point guns at each other. The officers had to step in. People who had brought black servants noticed they often turned up missing when they found out that Mexico didn't allow slavery. The biggest worry for the girls back home, besides the danger, was the fandangos. Young boys were sent to camps yelling, "Fandango, fandango!" Soldiers could pay money to dance with the young senoritas. Many times it ended more intimately, willingly on the girls' part, or sometimes not. Word got back to St. Louis about the fandangos. Julia might have reassured herself with the knowledge that Ulysses didn't dance. There are 2 conflicting reports about Matamoros and the troop behavior. Both of them were written by Ulysses Grant. The first one here is written in his personal memoirs. And remember, he really admired Taylor and found it hard to criticize him. The time was whiled away pleasantly enough at Matamoros, while we were waiting for volunteers. It is probable that all the most important people of the territory occupied by our army left their homes before we got there, but with those remaining, the best of relations apparently existed. It was the policy of the commanding general to allow no pillaging, no taking of private property for public or individual use without satisfactory compensation, so that a better market was afforded than the people had ever known before. This is a letter that Grant wrote to Julia in 1846 when he was in Matamoros and he could see what was going on. Since we have been in Matamoros, a great many murders have been committed, and what is strange, there seems to be but very weak means made use of to prevent frequent repetitions. Some of the volunteers and about all the Texans seem to think it's perfectly right to impose upon the people of a conquered city to any extent, and even to murder them where the act can be covered by the dark. And how much they seem to enjoy the acts of violence too. I would not pretend to guess the number of murders that have been committed here upon the persons of poor Mexicans and our soldiers since we have been here, but the number would startle you. Ex-Congressman Thomas Hamer joined Taylor's army. This is the guy who gave Grant his appointment to West Point and changed his name. He was for the Mexican War and had raised troops for it in Ohio. He was a political appointment and expected to be made a general. Politicians who raised a lot of troops were often appointed generals, usually to the detriment of the cause. Because he knew so little about war tactics, Grant volunteered to teach him. Here is part of a letter he wrote to a friend referring to Ulysses. Young as he is, he has been a great value and service to me. Today, after being freed from the duty of wrestling with the problem of reducing a train of refractory mules and their drivers to submissive order, we rode into the country several miles, and taking our positions upon an elevated mound, he explained to me many army evolutions. And supposing ourselves to be generals commanding opposing armies and a battle to be in progress, he explained supposititious maneuvers of the opposing forces in a most instructive way. And when I thought his imaginary force had my army routed, he suddenly suggested a strategic move for my forces which crowned them with triumphant victory and himself with defeat. And he ended by gracefully offering to surrender his sword. Of course, Lieutenant Grant is too young for command, but his capacity for future military usefulness is undoubted. In August 1846, Taylor finally had the new volunteers he needed to go after the Mexicans in Monterrey. So they decided to head out, and the first stop was going to be Camargo. This is Grant describing what it was like to be quartermaster when they had to use a train of Mexican pack mules. The roads were not good enough even for the wagons, so they had to pack and load these pack mules, who were not very happy about it. After the troops started, the tents and the cooking utensils had to be made into packages so that they could be lashed to the backs of the mules. Sheet iron kettles, tent poles, and mess chests were inconvenient articles to transport in that way. It took several hours to get ready to start each morning, and by the time we were ready, some of the mules first loaded would be tired of standing so long with their loads on their back. Sometimes one would start to run, bowing his back and kicking up until he scattered his load. Others would lie down and try to disarrange their loads by attempting to get on the top of them by rolling on them. Others, with tent poles for part of their loads, would manage to run a tent pole on one side of a sapling while they would take the other. I am not aware of ever having used a profane expletive in my life, but I would have the charity to excuse those who may have done so if they were in charge of a train of Mexican pack mules at the time. For some reason, when they got to Camargo, all sorts of diseases started hitting. The diseases killed more men than bullets. While there, 1 in 8 of the soldiers died, a total of 1,500. That was a shocking number. Unsanitary camp conditions and ignorance of how disease was spread was part of the cause. Men relieved themselves in camp near water sources. The illnesses that ran rapid were dysentery, measles, and other assorted ailments. Hundreds of young men were buried in shallow graves, shrouded in their blankets. Because of the illnesses, Taylor left half his army in Camargo. It was about a 100-mile march to Monterrey, where the Mexican army was encamped. Hamer was one of the soldiers who got ill in Camargo but lived until Monterrey. This is what the town of Monterrey looked like as troops approached it from the north. The Mexican strength for the battle was 10,000, and they were all entrenched. They were led by Ampudia, and there were only 6,000 soldiers under Taylor. This picture depicts the town against the mountains with one of the Mexican fortified sites, the Bishop's Palace, in the foreground. Taylor encamped about 3 miles out of town at a place they named Walnut Springs. Pecan trees grew there. Grant was told to remain behind and supervise the protection of supplies and equipment. But when the battle started, he got curious and rode in. The Battle of Monterrey, September 21st to the 24th, 1846. According to Grant, my curiosity got the better of my judgment, and I mounted a horse and rode to the front to see what was going on. I had been there but a short time when an order to charge was given, and lacking the moral courage to return to camp where I had been ordered to stay, I charged with the regiment. As soon as the troops were out of the depression, they came under fire of the Black Fort. As they advanced, they got under fire from batteries guarding the east or lower end of the city, and of musketry. About 1/3 of the men engaged in the charge were killed or wounded in the space of a few minutes. We retreated to get out of fire. Grant believed Garland could have just gone around the fort, out of range with no deaths. This is a mop. The next task of Grant's regiment was to enter the city and fight their way through several blocks of fortified 2-story houses and take the plaza. This was extremely hazardous. These houses were built by the Spanish. They're made out of stone, and they were 2 stories high. Sandbags had been placed on their roofs as parapets, and soldiers were shooting down on them. The cross streets were especially hazardous. When they got close to the plaza, they were about out of ammunition and needed a volunteer to ride back and let Taylor know. Grant volunteered. As he describes it, my ride back was an exposed one. Before starting, I adjusted myself on the side of my horse furthest from the enemy, and with only 1 foot holding to the cantle of the saddle and an arm over the neck of the horse exposed, I started at full run. It was only at street crossings that my horse was under fire, but these I crossed at such a flying rate that generally I was past and under cover of the next block of houses before the enemy fired. I got out safely without a scratch. Grant did not have to go back. The Mexicans surrendered, and Taylor allowed them to leave the city with all their weapons and horses. Hamer died on December 2nd, 1846. He died in Monterrey, but he was too sick to participate in the battle. Grant was chosen to write his widow with the news. When Major Hamer wrote 3 days before his death, no one expected a fatal ending, but neither the skill of our surgeons nor the loving attention of his friends availed to save him. He died as a soldier dies, without fear and without a murmur. His regret was that, if death must come, it should not come to him on the field of battle. He was mindful to the last of all those at home who would most suffer. He died within the sound of battle, and that was a pleasure to him as a brave soldier. He was buried with the honors of war and with the flag of his beloved country around him. All things will be forwarded in due course of regulations. Personally, his death is a loss to me which no words can express. Respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant, Second Lieutenant and Quartermaster. The family asked that his body be returned to Ohio. The Army did as they requested, and over 10,000 Ohio citizens met it at the train station. Grant lost some dear friends in the Battle of Monterey, and you can see from this letter and the two following that it's starting to get to him. This letter was written at a camp near Monterey, Mexico, September 23rd, 1846. My dear Julia, we are now playing upon them with pieces of artillery and ammunition that we have captured, but they still hold their citadel and artillery enough to man it. Our loss has been very great, particularly in the 3rd and 4th Infantry. The killed and wounded officers runs as follows, leaving out a number of volunteers who I do not know the names of. First Lieutenant Captain Lamont, an arm off. Lieutenant Terrett, badly wounded and in the hands of the Mexicans. Lieutenant Dilworth, lost a leg. 3rd Infantry Captain Morris, Captain Field Major Barber, Lieutenant Irwin, and Lieutenant Hazlitt, killed. Major Lear, severely wounded, the ball passing in the nose and out the ear. His recovery doubtful. 4th Infantry Lieutenant Hoskins and Lieutenant Woods killed, and Lieutenant Graham severely wounded. In the other regiment, there was more or less killed or wounded, but the loss not so severe. I passed through some severe firing, but as yet have escaped unhurt. This is a letter to Julia, written October 3rd. But many is the leg or arm that will be buried in this country, while the owners will live to relate over and over again the scenes they witnessed during the siege of Monterey. I told you in my last letter the officers that you were acquainted with that suffered, but for fear the letter may not reach you, I will enumerate them again. Captain Morris of the 3rd Infantry, Major Barber, Captain Field, Lieutenant Irwin, Lieutenant Hazlitt, Lieutenant Hoskins, and Lieutenant Terrett and Dilworth, since dead. Lieutenant Graham and Major Lear, dangerously wounded. According to one historian, if you got shot, you would look, and if it was in the trunk of your body, it was probably all over. If it was in an arm or a leg, the surgeons could take it off so you might live. So you always hope for an injury in one of your extremities. It was said that Grant was in the street when a cart full of dead bodies came by, and he saw his friend Lieutenant Hazlitt in the pile. This is a letter to Julia a few weeks later at camp near Monterey, Mexico, October 20th, 1846. How very, very lonesome it is here with us now. I have just been walking through camp, and how many faces that were dear to the most of us are missing now. Just 1 month ago this night, the 4th Infantry left this camp not to return again until it had lost 3 of its finest officers. Lieutenant Graham has since died. I came back to my tent to drive away what you call the blues. So it's been a while, and Grant just can't seem to get over losing his friends. Now, another thing that was important to them was receiving letters, and Julia did not seem to be the best correspondent. But it could be that it was just hard for the letters to get there. They had to go by ship and then across Mexico. So maybe she had written punctually and they just didn't get there. But in one letter, he said, "It has only been a few days since I received your letters. I answered them immediately. Won't you be as punctual in answering mine in the future? You don't know, Julia, how much anxiety and suspense I await their arrival. But here I am asking you to write soon, and in the same letter, asking permission to have you write, and without knowing the favor will be granted. If the proper consent is obtained, I know you will follow the example of punctuality I have set." So several times in his correspondence with her, he tells her how punctual he is and asks her to be just as punctual with the replies. After the battle, the army occupied Monterrey for some time. This is a description written in his personal memoirs years afterward about the surrender of the garrison and the quiet camp life that was led until midwinter. There are no corresponding letters that were written at that time where he describes life in Monterrey. So see what you believe. After the surrender of the garrison of Monterrey, a quiet camp life was led until midwinter. As had been the case on the Rio Grande, the people who remained at their homes fraternized with the Yankees in the pleasantest manner. In fact, under the humane policy of our commander, I question whether the great majority of Mexican people did not regret our departure as much as they had regretted our coming. Property and person were thoroughly protected, and a market was afforded for all the products of the country, such as the people had never enjoyed before. Whether you believe it or not, it could be that maybe all the bad guys had died in Camargo. The guy in the middle is President Polk. He needed generals to increase slave territory, but winning generals get elected president. He did not want a Whig president, but both of the top generals were Whigs. Then there's Zachary Taylor over to the left. He was a Whig. He was originally non-political. No one thought he had any political ambitions, but he became a winning general, and the Whig Party took note of this and started mentioning him as a candidate for the presidency. Then on the right, we have Winfield Scott, the top general. He too was a Whig. Top-ranking general, wanted the presidency, but he hadn't won any battles in this war yet because Polk did not want to send him in at the beginning because he might want the presidency. So this is Grant explaining it. The administration has indeed a most embarrassing problem to solve. Taylor, selected for his lack of political ambition, had himself become a prominent candidate for the presidency. Taylor could not be relieved from duty in the field where all of his battles had been victories. The design would have been too transparent. It was finally decided to send General Scott to Mexico in chief command and to authorize him to carry out his own original plan. That is, capture Veracruz and march upon the capital of the country. To do this, Scott would very sadly have to take away most of Taylor's troops. Grant and 4th Infantry were transferred to Worth's command, and he finds himself marching back to Point Isabel. On the march, he discovered that Worth was a bit crazy. Worth seems to be paranoid, and the troops have to suffer because of imaginary attackers out there in the dark. One time on the trip, camp was set up and soldiers had gone to sleep. Worth wakes them up, makes them pack up, and do a night march all night to get away from the Mexican soldiers that Worth has imagined are out there. They have weeks to wait for transportation, so there's absolutely no rush to get there. Yes, this is the guy that Fort Worth, Texas is named after, because he established the fort to protect settlers from Indians, although he never went there. This is Grant's opinion of William Worth in his personal memoirs. I found General Worth a different man from any I had before served directly under. He was nervous, impatient, and restless on the march, or when important or responsible duty confronted him. There was not the least reason for haste on the march, for it was known that it would take weeks to assemble shipping enough at the point of our embarkation to carry the army. But General Worth moved his division with a rapidity that would have been commendable had he been going to the relief of a beleaguered garrison. Some commanders can move troops so as to get the maximum distance out of them without fatigue, while others can wear them out in a few days without accomplishing so much. General Worth belonged to this latter class. He enjoyed, however, a fine reputation for his fighting qualities and thus attached his officers and men to him. Grant on Winfield Scott. General Scott was the reverse of Taylor. He always wore all the uniform prescribed or allowed by law when he inspected his lines. Word would be sent out to all commanders in advance, notifying them when the commanding general might be expected. This was done so that all the army might be under arms to salute their chief as he passed. General Scott was precise in language, cultivated a style of his own, was proud of his rhetoric, and not averse to speaking of himself, often in the third person. And he could bestow praise upon the person he was talking about without the least embarrassment. The soldiers boarded 50 ships and took the 500-mile trip from Point Isabel to Veracruz. The trip was a comfortless one for officers and men. The transports used were built for carrying freight and possessed limited accommodations for passengers, and the climate added to the discomfort of all. But when they arrived, Mexicans threw almost no obstacles in the way of landing. During the debarkation, one shot took off the head of Major Albertus. Scott's army put Veracruz under siege starting March 9th, and as Grant described it, the siege continued with brisk firing on our side till the 27th of March, by which time a considerable breach had been made in the wall surrounding the city. Upon this, General Morales, who was governor of both the city and of San Juan de Ulloa, commenced a correspondence with General Scott looking to the surrender of the town, forts, and garrison. On the 29th, Veracruz and San Juan de Ulloa were occupied by Scott's army. About 5,000 prisoners and 400 pieces of artillery, besides large amounts of small arms and ammunition, fell into the hands of the victorious force. The casualties on our side during the siege amounted to 64 officers and men killed and wounded. Scott had a choice of two roads from Veracruz to the city of Mexico. that could be taken by an army, one by Jalapa and Perote, the other by Cordova and Orizaba, the two coming together on the Great Plains which extends to the city of Mexico after the range of mountains is passed. Scott chose the Jalapa-Perote road. They were in a hurry to leave Veracruz because the vomito, or yellow fever, was about to arrive. Cerro Gordo is one of the higher spurs of the mountains, some 12 to 15 miles east of Jalapa. Santa Anna had selected this point as the easiest to defend against an invading army. The road was defended at every turn by artillery. On either side were deep chasms or mountain walls. A direct attack along the road was an impossibility. Scott sent out engineers, including Robert E. Lee, to look for a way around the road. They found one that required men using ropes to lift and lower artillery up and down steep ravines until they arrived clandestinely behind Santa Anna's entrenched troops. They surprised and routed them. According to Grant, the surprise of the enemy was complete, the victory overwhelming. Some 3,000 prisoners fell into Scott's hands, also a large amount of ordnance and ordnance stores. Troops captured $30,000 in gold and a wooden leg from Santa Anna. Scott moved to Jalapa and Grant moved with Worth to the city of Puebla. As Worth's troops camped near Jalapa, Grant decided he had just seen the most beautiful city ever. He wrote to Julia, "Jalapa is decidedly the most beautiful place I ever saw in my life. From its low latitude and great elevation, it is never hot nor never cold. The climate is said to be the best in the world, and from what I saw, I would be willing to make Jalapa my home for life, with only one condition, and that would be that I should be permitted to go and bring my dearest Julia." As Worth went ahead and occupied Puebla, Scott decided to stay behind to send back volunteers who refused to sign up for more time. He sent them back early to avoid the vomito. He would be losing 4,000 troops at this time. Grant got to see General Worth in action once more in Puebla. General Worth was in command at Puebla until the latter end of May, when General Scott arrived. Here, as well as on the march up, his restlessness, particularly under responsibilities, showed itself. During his brief command, he had the enemy hovering around near the city in vastly superior numbers to his own. The brigade to which I was attached changed quarters 3 different times in about a week, occupying at first quarters near the plaza in the heart of the city, then at the western entrance, then at the extreme east. On one occasion, Worth had the troops in line, under arms, all day, with 3 days' cooked ration in their haversacks. He galloped from one command to another, proclaiming the near proximity of Santa Anna with an army vastly superior to his own. Grant decided instead of getting angry, he would just find this man amusing. So that's how he handled the situation. The Mexicans observing this going on said that the gringos were loco. Finally, General Scott arrived upon the scene the latter part of the month, May 28th, and nothing more was heard of Santa Anna and his myriads. This is Puebla with Popocatépetl in the background. When the Americans were there, it had not erupted since 1802. It was dormant for over 100 years, then rather active recently. The last one was in February 2024. The army stayed in Puebla about 2.5 months. While there, young men and women started to notice each other. The mayor lived next door, and he had two daughters, one beautiful one who he had adopted, and the other was a good natured girl. They started bringing food to a sick friend of Grant's, then invited him and his friends in for cards, dinner, and entertainment. Soon, threatening notes impugning their morality began appearing on the church door. It was discovered that it was a young aristocrat who was planning an assassination of Grant and his friend. After they had it out with the young man by kicking him down a hall, his father apologized. There was nothing in the letters back home to Julia about it, but we know she was still socializing and going to dances herself. Grant had to continue his quartermaster work in Pueblo. He was probably a lot busier than the regular soldiers who did a minimum of drills and guard duty. According to Grant, I was sent as quartermaster with a large train of wagons back 2 days' march at least to procure forage. We had less than 1,000 men at escort and never thought of danger. We procured full loads for our entire train at 2 plantations, which could easily have furnished as much more. Grant felt perfectly safe on 2-day missions with only 1,000-man cavalry to get forage from farms along the way. On August 7th, Polk had finally sent Scott enough reinforcements to get on with it, and the advanced division reached the summit in 3 days after leaving Pueblo on their way to Mexico City. At the summit, men were astounded when the view of Mexico City Valley appeared as they reached the summit of the road. It is similar to our view of Denver as we go under the bridge near Genesee on I-70 toward Denver. Most had never seen anything like it. The city of Mexico lies west of Rio Frio Mountain on a plain backed by another mountain 6 miles farther west, with others still nearer on the north and south. Between the western base of Rio Frio and the city of Mexico, there are 3 lakes, Lake Chalco and Xochimilco on the left and Texcoco on the right. There is a high rocky mountain called El Peñon at the right of the road, springing up from the low flat ground dividing the lakes. This mound was strengthened by entrenchments at its base and summit and rendered a direct attack impractical. This is a map of the route from Puebla to Mexico City. The troops stopped first at Ayolta for reconnaissance. The El Peñon is located on the south side of Lake Texcoco on the main road to Mexico City. Scott, after receiving reconnaissance reports, opted to go south of Lake Chalco to a resort town of Tlalpan, located by a recent pile of volcanic debris called the Pedregal. The reconnaissance team discovered the entrenchments on the El Peñon rock, which would result in high casualties. Instead, they suggested the army go south around Chalco and Lake Xochimilco to the town of San Antonio. The town is located near some lava deposits called the Pedregal. It is extremely difficult territory to walk through. On the other side of the Pedregal is Contreras, where some Mexican troops were located. Scott sent some engineers headed by Robert E. Lee to find a way through the Pedregal to surprise the soldiers. This he does. The attack goes well. The Mexican troops flee to Churubusco, closer to Mexico City. Grant just watches the battle with binoculars. His regiment will not be involved in this one. This is the route they took from the top of Lake Chalco, around underneath it, and then between a little mountainous area and Xochimilco, over to the Pedregal. Scott discovers that a portion of the Mexican army was on the other side of the Pedregal at Contreras. He assigns engineers, led by Robert E. Lee, to find a road through the piles of volcanic rocks so they can do a surprise flanking maneuver. The road is complete by August 19th and the battle begins. The 4th Infantry is not involved as they have been sent to San Antonio. Grant climbs up on the Pedregal and with his binoculars watches the battle, which turns into a rout of the Mexicans, who fall back to Churubusco. He can also see the unhappy reactions of the people in Mexico City. Here is the route to Contreras that Lee and his company of engineers found on the south side of the Pedregal. Churubusco was one of the bloodiest battles for the Mexican capital. St. Patrick's Battalion, also called the San Patricios, was there. The battalion was composed of Catholic soldiers who had deserted the U.S. Army and gone over to the Mexicans. They were mostly Irish immigrants. They knew what was going to happen to them if they were captured, so they were fighting as if their lives depended on it. The bloodiest fighting was near the Pont de Tete, or the bridgehead, and the convent, which the San Patricios were defending. 72 men were ultimately captured and court-martialed for desertion, including the leader, John O'Reilly. Scott finally agreed to a truce because Santa Anna said they were ready to negotiate with Trist. Instead of negotiation, the Mexicans used this time to prepare and entrench to try to prevent the troops from entering Mexico City. This map shows the paths of the divided American forces who joined up for an assault on Churubusco. This is one of the few actual images taken in the Mexican War. Almost all pictures illustrating the war are drawings or paintings by people who were not there. The daguerreotype was the first process that became available to the public in the 1840s. It was replaced by another process in 1856. Of all things to photograph, this shows an amputation during the Mexican War. The surgeon is holding the leg. One of the few ways that surgeons actually save lives. If you got some part of your body badly injured and it couldn't be amputated, you probably weren't going to make it. The American troops moved closer to Mexico City. This map shows the route between Churubusco and Molino del Rey, the next battle. On September 6, 1847, Scott ended the armistice following the Battle of Churubusco as negotiations broke down. It became clear that Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was preparing to resume fighting. On September 7th, a large number of Mexican horsemen were observed around a group of low, massive stone buildings surrounded by trees known as El Molino del Rey. General Winfield Scott received reports that the trees masked a foundry for casting cannon, a false report. It was a grain mill. Scott ordered General Worth to attack and take the mill, break up the factory, and destroy any munitions found. About his actions in this battle, Grant said, "I climbed to the roof of the building, followed by a few men, but found a private soldier had preceded me by some other way. There were still quite a number of Mexicans on the roof, among them a major and 5 or 6 officers of lower grades, who had not succeeded in getting away before our troops occupied the building. They still had their arms, while the soldier before mentioned was walking a sentry guarding the prisoners he had surrounded all by himself. I halted the sentinel, received the swords from the commissioned officers, and proceeded, with the assistance of the soldiers now with me, to disable the muskets by striking them against the edge of the wall and throwing them to the ground below. This is an artist's depiction of Molino del Rey. You can see it in the foreground. It's the building that's rectangular, and beside it to the right is another building up on a hill, and that is Chapultepec. This map shows the route between Molino del Rey and Chapultepec. They were very close together. Grant thought that the Battle of Molino del Rey could have been handled better, and that would have saved lives at Chapultepec. It had not taken long to get the Mexican soldiers out of the mill and on the run. Grant thought with the Mexican soldiers on the run, if U.S. troops had immediately received a command to follow them, the Americans would have gone over the walls of Chapultepec almost with the Mexican soldiers, and the Mexican defense would not have been able to fire because they would have struck their own soldiers. Of course, following retreated soldiers, he thought, should always be a standing order. The general in charge would have had to actually be at the battle to make the call. Winfield Scott liked to stay at headquarters and see the battle through the eyes of his staff. This is Chapultepec as it looks today. Today it serves as a museum and garden for Mexico City. Back during the Mexican War, it served as a school for young military cadets of Mexico. It was originally built as a palace for a Spanish aristocrat. Mainly Irish Catholics deserted to the Mexicans and fought for Mexico. There were some German and some French also. They were captured at Churubusco and court-martialed. Because they were responsible for the deaths of many American troops, the court-martial came down hard on them. If desertion had occurred before the war was declared, they got 50 lashes and a D branded on their cheek. If desertion occurred after the war, the punishment was death by hanging. Each condemned man was made to stand in the back of a wagon with a suspended rope around his neck and watch the Battle of Chapultepec. When the American flag went up on Chapultepec, the drivers were told to roll the wagons. This is an artist's depiction of the hanging of the San Patricios. Do you think that what the American military did to the deserters was fair? The attack on San Cosme Garita, or Gate of Mexico City. Worst Brigade advanced on the San Cosme Road, which was a causeway in the middle of a swamp with an aqueduct in the middle. The only place to seek cover was under the archways that held up the aqueducts. Grant asked for volunteers to flank a barricade of Mexican soldiers. The volunteers he collected from his own platoon were joined by another platoon and some Marines. This group took the San Cosme Gate and were the first to enter Mexico City. They didn't get to stay long. They were recalled because the group was thought to be too small to hold the city. Back on the outside again, Grant and some more volunteers dismantled a gun and headed toward a church. The priest who met them at the door was polite but refused him entrance. Grant let him know in his very elementary Spanish that he was coming in no matter what. After gaining entrance, they headed for the belfry where the gun was reassembled. The effective shots from the belfry gained the attention of Worth. He asked Grant to pay him a visit. He commended Grant and then sent back another gun. The belfry wasn't big enough for two guns, so only one was used. After the army made it into Mexico City, Santa Anna resigned as president of Mexico. U.S. forces under General Winfield Scott then occupied Mexico, but convicts had been released and armed by Santa Anna, so the troops were aggressive for a few days in defending themselves against them. Scott, the victorious general, rode into the city and took control of the government buildings, better known as the Halls of Montezuma. He wore all the uniform he was allowed to have. After the city calmed down, the troops were moved to villages outside. Grant, as quartermaster, was busy with getting uniforms for the 4th Regiment sewn by Mexicans and hiring bakers to make bread. He used money made from baking bread to order subscriptions and to pay band members who provided entertainment for the troops. Grant and some other officers were billeted at a Catholic church. At first, they practically had to hack their way in, but after a while, Grant made friends with the Catholic priest. The priest had a nephew who became their mascot. They fed him dinner every night and took him out on rides. The nephew wanted to ride a particularly spirited horse that belonged to someone that Grant knew. Grant tried to discourage him, but then it became a matter of honor, so Grant took him riding on the Aqueduct Road. He overreacted and was thrown into a tree. He was killed. Grant took the body back to his mother, and a terrible scene ensued. Grant and all the other officers attended the funeral and were all on their knees holding candles. Grant got to know Franklin Pierce quite well. They discovered they were both avid cribbage players. With a lot of time to kill while they were waiting for negotiations to take place, Grant would ride into town every day, and he and Pierce would have a cribbage match. Pierce was in his 40s, Grant was in his 20s. You wonder if anybody looking at the two of them playing cards realized they were looking at two future presidents of the United States. Every Sunday there was a bullfight for the amusement of those who would pay their 50 cents. Grant attended one of them, just one, not wishing to leave the country without having witnessed the national sport. The sight to him was sickening. He could not see how human beings could enjoy the suffering of beasts, and often of men, as they seemed to do on these occasions. Watching the gory spectacle in Mexico affected him so much that he called the matadors who actually killed the bull during the bullfight literally murderers. Grant had fought in 2 wars and seen countless dead and maimed bodies, but the barbarity of bullfighting stayed with him the rest of his life. Later on, after he was president, he went down to Mexico and they wanted to put a bullfight on in his honor. He turned them down. After Grant had become famous and been in 2 big wars, Lieutenant Colonel Joshua Howard remembered a visit from Grant. At the time, Howard was in command of Chapultepec. His office was at the bottom of a flight of steep stone steps. Grant came to visit, and he could not find a place to tether his horse at the high breastworks at the top of the stairs. So he jumped the breastworks and clattered down a long, steep flight of stairs to Howard's door. He hitched the animal and went in. When he and Howard walked out after the visit, Howard gasped, "How in the world did you get your horse down here?" "Rode him down, sir." "How do you expect to get him out?" "Ride him up the stairs instead of down." With that, Grant put his horse up the steps like a cat, and with a wave of his hat, jumped the breastworks and was gone. Grant and some other young officers decided to take leave and try to climb one of Mexico's tallest volcanoes, Popocatépetl, 17,500 feet. They started at a little village called Ozumba near the base of the volcano. They procured guides and 2 pack mules with forage for the horses. High up on the mountain there was a deserted house called the Vaqueria. It was possible to go up on horseback as far as the Vicaria, though the road was somewhat hazardous in places. At one of these places, one of the mules, loaded with 2 sacks of barley, struck his load against the mountainside and was precipitated to the bottom. The descent was steep but not perpendicular. The mule rolled over and over until the bottom was reached, and they supposed that the poor animal had been dashed to pieces. They were surprised, not long after they had gone into bivouac, to see the lost mule, cargo, and owner coming up the ascent. The load had protected the animal from serious injury. The night at the Vicaria, which had half a roof, was horrible. It was very cold, and the rain fell in torrents. As soon as it was light the next morning, they started to make the ascent to the summit. The wind continued to blow with violence. It carried the loose snow around the mountainsides in such volumes as to make it almost impossible to stand up against it. They concluded to return. The descent was easy, rapid, though dangerous. At the cabin, they mounted the horses and were at Ozumba by evening. The fatigues of the day and the loss of sleep the night before drove them early to their bed of blankets on a dirt floor. By morning, the eyes of half the party were so swollen that they were entirely closed. They concluded to make a start back. Those who could see were leading the horses of those who could not see at all. Okay, discussion question. What caused the swelling of the eyes? Half the party decided to go back and climb Popocatépetl. The other half decided to go visit the Mexican caves. Grant went with the cave group. The half that went back to the volcano actually had some members make it to the summit, and they even wrote articles about it. However, that didn't prove they were superior in every way, because many of them had to surrender to Grant in the Civil War. After some difficulty and a couple of days getting there, the cave group arrived at a town close to the caves. The next morning they were at the mouth of the cave at an early hour. They had hired guides who supplied candles and rockets to use to view the caves. They explored to a distance of about 3 miles from the entrance and found a succession of chambers of great dimensions and great beauty when lit up with the rockets. Some of the party became satisfied with their explorations before the end of the tour and started back without the guides. Coming to a large column, they had followed it entirely around and commenced retracing their steps into the bowels of the mountain without being aware of the fact. When the rest of them had completed their journey, they started out with their guides, but had not gone far before they saw torches of an approaching party. They could not conceive of who these could be. There was no one else at the entrance when they started in. Very soon they found it was their friends. It took them some time to conceive how they got where they were. They were sure they had kept straight on for the mouth of the cave and had gone about as far enough to have reached it. After the last battles of the Mexican War, a sizable force of regular U.S. Army troops occupied Mexico City. On October 13, 1847, a meeting of the officers was held in the city to form a social organization to help pass the time comfortably until their return to the United States. Membership was extended to all officers who had served in the campaign from Veracruz on. The site chosen for its clubhouse was an 18th century palace initially built for the Viceroy of New Spain. Winfield Scott wanted to reward his officers, so using military funds, he hired locals to spruce up the old building, turning it into the Aztec Club. Only officers who had served with him from Veracruz to the occupation of Mexico City were allowed to attend the private club. The Aztec was a stunning hit with the officers. It allowed them to escape the city's dirt and grime and escape the smell of death. He selected upscale meals to be served, and the finest whiskeys were provided for those who drank. On occasion, local talent performed. It was in the building to the left of the cathedral. Okay. Nicholas Trist was chosen as the negotiator for the Mexican War because he had State Department experience, he had experience in negotiations, and he spoke fluent Spanish. Now, Scott thought that he was just a clerk because for some reason clerk was in his title, and since he was along, Scott feared that he had to consult Trist about any military decisions. This was not true. So the two of them wrote back and forth letters, and both of them were angry with each other. They were in the same town but would not meet and would not speak to each other. But finally, Trist got sick, and Scott sent him a jar of guava jelly, and that made Trist feel better. They met, they became good friends, and that was the way it was to the end of the war. But at the end of the war, there was no one to negotiate with. So finally, a special Mexican committee decided to negotiate with the Americans just to get rid of them. Now, Polk decided to recall Trist. For some reason, he had heard what was going on in the negotiations, and he didn't like it because he wanted the Baja Peninsula, and there was no way that he was going to be getting that. So he then recalled Trist, and Scott told him, just ignore him, go ahead and finish the negotiations. We need to strike while the iron is hot. So Trist got them by being very polite and speaking good Spanish and being very concerned. He got them to give up 55% of their territory. Now, the U.S. paid them $15 million for it, or about a nickel an acre. So Congress did indeed ratify the treaty, but Polk was still mad, and he refused to pay Trist. Trist never got paid for his work until Ulysses Grant became president, and then he paid Trist for what he had done. Okay, the Mexican War had been won, and Polk still had one more thing to do, and that was to undermine Scott. He had put three of the most argumentative, obnoxious generals in the army underneath Scott. So they started giving Scott a hard time. They got obnoxious. They did not obey orders. So Scott had them arrested. That was probably a big mistake. Okay, so when it came to the court-martial, Polk had his group in there, and instead of looking at the three guys who were doing, who were being argumentative and obnoxious, they kicked out Scott. So Scott was told that he had to go home. So that way, Polk won both ways. He won the territory, and he got rid of Scott as a real threat to the presidency. Could this have been the plan all along? This is the land that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo brought into the United States. Nicholas Trist negotiated with a special commission representing the collapsed government. President Polk had recalled Trist in October 1847 under the belief that negotiations would be carried out with a Mexican delegation in Washington. In the 6 weeks it took to deliver Polk's message, Trist received word that the Mexican government had named its special commission to negotiate. Trist determined that Washington did not understand the situation in Mexico and negotiated the peace treaty in defiance of the president. Winfield Scott urged him to keep negotiations, as he understood the situation too. On Trist's return to Washington, he was promptly fired by Polk and denied any salary payments earned during treaty negotiations. Trist's political career was over at that point, and he took a series of office jobs for the next 22 years. In 1871, Trist received his back pay and was appointed postmaster of Alexander, Virginia by Ulysses S. Grant. Some people were upset about the treaty because in the treaty, Tris gave any Mexicans who were living on land that now became the United States citizenship to the United States. People were upset about this because Mexicans were not white. So here's a statement by John C. Calhoun on Mexicans. It says, "We ever incorporated into the Union any but the Caucasian race. To incorporate Mexico would be the first departure of the kind, for more than half of its population are pure Indians, and by far the larger portion of the residue mixed blood. I protest against the incorporation of such a people. Ours is a government of white men. The great misfortune of what was formerly Spanish America is to be traced to the fatal error of placing the colored race on an equality with the white. That error destroyed the social arrangement which formed the basis of their society." It was finally time to go home. On May 19, 1848, the Mexican Senate also ratified the treaty. On May 30th, U.S. troops began to leave Mexico City. The same day that the Mexican and U.S. governments exchanged formal notification of the treaty ratification. Members in 1868. The photograph featuring members of the Aztec Club with guests was taken at the mansion of General Robert Patterson in Philadelphia during an anniversary dinner of the club on September 16, 1873. They had rules that kept it going as an inherited membership for males only.